computer. And now I'm going to make, are we ready for the introduction? Okay,
Looks like
great. All right, before we introduce our esteemed guest tonight, just a quick show of hands. How many people here have ever seen whooping crane?
one.
Wayne, wow. Okay, so this is a big treat here. We're going to be getting a lot of new knowledge here. Wayne, when did you see a whooping crane? Wait, you're muted. Could someone tell Wayne he's muted?
I don't think I'm muted anymore.
No.
Correct.
Yeah, I had the privilege of going on Captain Ted's boat at, I guess, Aransas many years ago, and it was a joy to be able to see those birds. I'm looking forward to hearing about their current status.
Well, that's great. All right, and I know it's on everybody's bucket list here. Anyway, so let me give you a quick little introduction to our guest tonight. Oh, actually, hold on a second. I cannot minimize screens here. Hold on. Okay, hold on. Paityn Bauer, she is the outreach biologist for the International Crane Foundation Texas program. She completed her bachelor's degree in biology at the University of Central Oklahoma. And then she obtained her master's degree in marine conservation from the University of Miami with a focus on light pollution and its effects on sea turtle hatchlings. Her background includes the study of both freshwater and marine turtles with an emphasis on outreach and education. And she now works to increase awareness, empathy, and appreciation for, you guessed it, whooping cranes along the Texas Gulf Coast. Paityn, take it away.
Thank you so much for that intro, Evan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys and get some slides up. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, you all just saw, except for one, your first whooping crane. I often get asked how I ended up from the turtle world into the bird world, and my answer is I love dinosaurs. Because the whooping crane is an extremely long-lived species. But today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the life of the whooping crane. Like Evan said, I'm the outreach biologist, and what that means is I do most of our outreach and education, but they also still let me do research sometimes, which is really fun. And I work under the umbrella of the Gulf Coast program. So we have an outreach team in Louisiana, and then we have a full satellite campus here in Texas. So right now I'm in Corpus Christi, but our office is in Rockport, Texas, very close to where our birds come down for the winter. So at the International Crane Foundation, we work worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. We work in over 50 countries across 5 continents to provide knowledge and leadership in an effort to protect cranes and the habitats on which they depend upon. In North America, many of you may know this, but we have 2 species of crane. We have the most abundant crane species, which is the sandhill crane. And in contrast, we also have the rarest of all crane species, which is the whooping crane. The whooping crane is currently listed as endangered and federally protected. There are 15 species of cranes found across the globe. They're all very unique and beautiful in their own ways. Unfortunately, due to various pressures, 10 of the 15 are currently listed as threatened or endangered, including, of course, our whooping crane. They are also, while they are also the rarest of all crane species, they're the tallest flying bird in North America. So they stand at about 5 feet tall. They're known for their snowy white plumage and their red crown, and we either call it a black face mask or a mustache, depending on how you ID birds. And they have typically yellow eyes. Red eyes have occurred. It typically points to excess in testosterone. And they also are known for their very pointed olive or brown colored beak. They weigh about 11 to 17 pounds. They have hollow bones like many other birds, and have a lifespan ranging from 22 to 24 years on average in the wild and 35 to 40 in captivity. We do have cranes in their 80s, so they can be pretty long-lived, and their wingspan ranges between 7 and 8 feet. So I'm going to point out a couple of anatomy characteristics that make whooping cranes whooping cranes. The first is the crown. It's often first. Can you guys see this control panel? Is it blocking your view of my slides? I want to make sure.
We don't see the control panel.
Okay, I'm gonna hide it just in case. The crown is often confused with feathers because it has a similar feather-like formation, but they're actually blood-filled sacs. So they can use these as a form of nonverbal communication, both during in their courtship practices, as well as any social behavior with other whooping cranes or other species. In this picture on your left, you can see it's really flattened across the skull. It's one way when we study these birds, we can kind of tell what their temperament is, because when it is that flat and not extra engorged or red, they're pretty quote unquote relaxed. So it's one way for if you ever see these birds in the wild, you can keep kind of a finger on what their attitude is towards your interaction by paying attention to their crown. Another really cool part of their anatomy is their trachea. This is where they get their name whooping crane from. It's actually because they have a 5-foot-long trachea and it's wrapped around their sternum, similar to a brass instrument. So their call can be heard up to 5 miles, and that's how they get that whooping name. On the Gulf Coast, we work with 2 populations of whooping cranes. I spoke a little bit about our Louisiana colleagues earlier. Where I'm at in Texas, I work with the Aransas wood buffalo population. This is what's called a remnant population. So they're technically our last wild population of whooping cranes, and they are currently self-sustaining, so they're breeding without our help. And they migrate all the way up from wood buffalo in northern Canada down to my area of the world, down here in coastal Texas. We also work with the Louisiana non-migratory population. This population was reintroduced in 2011 to White Lakes Wetland Conservation Area. And we also work with a few other whooping crane populations, including the eastern migratory population. They migrate between Wisconsin and Florida. These smaller green dots you see on your right are areas that they've actually started short stopping in recent years. So they've started short stopping in Alabama and Indiana. So we really try to focus our outreach efforts in those areas to make sure people know that we do have whooping cranes in some new areas. And this whooping crane population was reintroduced in 2001. They're pretty famous because they were taught to migrate using ultralight aircraft, similar to Fly Away Home. So they are one of our big success stories. Our other introduced population is the Florida non-migratory population. They were reintroduced in 1993, and we still have a few birds left here. Some of them have since been transported to Louisiana. They just kind of had a run of bad luck, but we do still have a few hanging out in that area. And this is a population that predated the International Crane Foundation. This was an experimental population in Idaho in the 1970s, where sandhill crane foster parents were given eggs from Aransas wood buffalo nest in hopes to reestablish a flock in this area. This was before we knew that whooping cranes imprinted on the first moving object. So they, of course, imprinted on sandhill cranes, wanted to live and breed with sandhill cranes, and that's how we got Whoopsies, which was a whooping crane sandhill crane hybrid. We still have a few out in the world today, but this program was shut down in the 1980s when we learned a little bit more about their ecology and life history. I talked a little bit about the Aransas population being the last remnant or wild population of whooping cranes. And the reason that they were able to recover a bit faster than the other populations and didn't require reintroduction is from a few habitat protections and formal protections that allowed them to rebound, including the establishment of the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in 1937. Both areas, both where they winter and summer, are pretty removed from human development, and they're able to kind of escape more developed areas in contrast to those other populations. So they were essentially able to kind of hide from human development, and it allowed for this faster rebounding rate. When they reached their lowest point, and we actually weren't able to figure out where they were nesting at, it was by chance a wildfire in 1954 was how we found that they were nesting in Wood Buffalo National Park. So it was either a plane or a helicopter, firefighters saw whooping crane nests from a bird's eye view, and they were able to tell researchers, hey, we have actually found where the whooping cranes are nesting. And researchers were able to go in and confirm that our population was still nesting and breeding and increasing. So we still have those two introduced populations that are still ongoing, both the eastern population and the Louisiana, but they're not self-sustaining yet. It is our goal to make them a self-sustaining population similar to that of our Aransas wood buffalo. So whooping cranes dramatically declined between the 1800s and the 1940s. It's historically thought that there may have been 10,000 or more individuals before European westward expansion. The figure on your right shows their historic range. The areas in yellow are their large wintering areas. As you can see, it's quite a bit larger than what they currently have today. Populations are very small habitat ranges compared to what they had pre their brush with extinction. In the early 1940s, this is when we only had 16 birds left in the Aransas wood buffalo population. And between 1944 and 45, we only had 21 whooping cranes in the wild. So what led to this dramatic decline? A major driver was habitat loss. The figure on your left shows wetland distribution between the 1780s and the 1980s. As they are a wetland dependent species, you can imagine without having that wetland habitat, it created quite a few issues, especially if I point your direction to the central United States. Our birds, the Aransas buffalo population, they use the Central Flyway, which includes Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. And these areas significantly decreased in wetland habitat. So this coincided in kind of a perfect storm with unregulated hunting and egg collection. Some of these figures show historic hunting as well as collection of feathers and eggs for personal and private collections, just led to this very heavy loss of birds. Unfortunately for our Louisiana population, this actually led to a complete extirpation of the species from Louisiana. In 1918, this was when the last observation of wild migratory whooping cranes in Louisiana were noted, when 12 were shot in a rice field. In 1939, this was the last documented successful breeding for whooping cranes in Louisiana. In 1940, a hurricane dispersed the flock, only 13 birds and 6 returned. And then in 1950, the last remaining wild bird was captured and transported to Texas, where she sadly died 6 months later. So essentially, until they were reintroduced in 2011, Louisiana birds were out of the state for about 60 years. So when we began reintroduction, we knew outreach and education would be really important because some of these newer generations didn't know that Louisiana had whooping cranes historically. But the way that we do reintroductions is ourselves and partners will raise chicks in captivity. This allows us to increase the amount of chicks we can release into that population per year. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries is the one that does these releases. The largest cohort so far that was released was about 24 juveniles. Before the release, chicks are given color bands and transmitters. LDWF pretty much knows exactly where each juvenile is throughout its lifespan because they only have about 80 birds, so they're able to check in pretty frequently. And before they're fully released into the Louisiana population, they're put in this top netted pen so that they can acclimate. And they're supplemented food items before they're fully released and are required to forage on their own. And you can tell they're juveniles from that cinnamon brown body color in contrast to their full adult white plumage. What's also really cool about this population is most of their historic prairie and coastal marshes have been converted to rice and ag fields. but the cranes are still utilizing those areas. So you can see their current range still mirrors that of their historic whooping crane habitat. So now, instead of nesting in Cajun prairie and marshes in totality, they are actually nesting in rice and crawfish fields. They have this pretty symbiotic relationship with farmers because farmers like that they keep other big birds off of their fields. And then they also have that emotional tie to having whooping cranes on their land. In the Louisiana population, their numbers have been steadily rising each year since 2011. The kind of brownish taupey color is the number of released birds per year. And the orange across the top is the amount of wild chicks that they are hatching themselves. And as that orange increases, the less birds we have to release from captive rearing facilities. And once we reach a sustainable number of birds, we will no longer need to do captive releasing. So we are on our way to a self-sustained population. We're just not quite there yet. And what's also very interesting about this population is because they're non-migratory, they have a longer breeding season. So they actually already have, our birds just left Texas, and the Louisiana birds actually already have chicks on the ground. So we already have chicks that are almost 2 months old in the Louisiana population because they have such a long breeding season. And they have about 8 nests that are waiting to hatch right now. So for most of this talk, I'll be talking about the Texas program because that's predominantly where I work. And we focus on 3 objectives. The first being research and monitoring on whooping cranes and their habitats so we can better understand the species as a whole. We also work with landowners and partners to make sure that we provide enough habitat for our cranes, along with Texas faces quite a bit of drought to make sure they have enough fresh water while they're there. And then my favorite part, of course, is outreach and community engagement to foster empathy and awareness for our cranes. This is what our population recovery has looked like through the years. So starting in the early 1940s at our only 16 birds, we have also been steadily rising pretty much each year. In the 1980s, we reached 134 birds. And today we're sitting at about 536 individuals within our population. So they're doing pretty well, but of course there is still a long road for them to travel to make sure that they are completely away from extinction. And I like to show this as well. This is all the whooping cranes in the world. We have a little over 800 whooping cranes in total, about 133 of these in captivity. And then about 536 in our population. And then in Eastern Louisiana, we have about 80 birds in each right now. And then we just have a handful of birds left in Florida. So I talked a little bit about how they are wetland dependent species. And of course, they rely on habitat along with population recovery. So a really smart group of people all got in one room and came up with a goal to not only downlist them from endangered to threatened, but also how much habitat would we need for this? So to have them be downlisted from endangered to threatened, we would need to protect sufficient habitat for 1,000 individuals, 250 of these being breeding pairs. Along with this, we would need to protect 125,000 acres of coastal marsh and 300,000 acres of coastal prairie and fresh marsh. Whooping cranes are thought to be a pretty territorial species. So when they're down here, they have their, we like to call them home ranges now, but they will get a little bit scrappy if another whooping crane comes into their territory. So they have these pretty broad territories. So we want to make sure we have sufficient habitat to be able to support ongoing population recovery. And we do have some more updated conservation concerns for our birds. One of the leading causes of mortality is actually collision with power lines, fences, and cars. Especially during windy days or cloudy days, this becomes an issue. And as they do migrate a pretty long ways, this also exacerbates this. Diseases such as highly pathogenic avian influenza, this has not occurred in whooping cranes yet, but has occurred in other crane populations. So we just want to be cognizant because it does require a pretty rapid response and can be fatal. Overutilization from both incidental take and poaching events. We want to make sure that this is at a number of 0. Along with past and present destruction of habitat, I like to really drive home how important habitat is for our birds. And then climate change can also affect where we find them on the salt marsh. So as sea level rises, it can affect their distribution along the coast. And then adequacy of legal protection. So if we do have an instance of incidental take or poaching, we want to make sure that they know the value of a whooping crane and are prosecuted to the fullest extent.
Slow down.
Oh, sorry about that. So I will talk more about some fun whooping crane facts now. The Aransas wood buffalo population is migratory. So they migrate about 2,500 miles through the Central Flyway. So it's a pretty long ways for migrating twice a year. It is a very narrow corridor, so it's only about 182 miles wide, and most of them stay pretty close to the center line. And they make 11 to 12 stopovers on average per migration. And they are diurnal migrants, so they do migrate during the day. So if you're in the Central Flyway during their migratory period, it is possible that you can see a whooping crane. Especially, I'm sure many of you know the Central Platte River is a great place for seeing cranes. We have some stopover sites that are protected because they're very important stopover sites for our cranes during migration, including the Saskatchewan staging area. This area falls between a triangle of rivers. So as they're either leaving or entering Canada, it's a great place for them to stop because it gives them a good roosting site and foraging site. So they'll stop here for a while. The Central Platte River is a beautiful place to see sandhill cranes and is a major stopover for whooping cranes as well. Kansas actually has 2 stopover sites that are protected, including Cheyenne Bottoms Wildlife Management Area and Cuviera National Wildlife Area. And I'm from Oklahoma, so my favorite by default is the Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. Like many other birds, they show pre-migratory restlessness. So this can look like an increase in running, dancing, or flying as they're progressing towards their migratory stage. It's thought to be a response to day length. So as photo periods increase, it's a cue that it's time to migrate. They also take similar social cues from the rest of the flock and migrate in groups and take advantage of weather conditions. So as soon, of course, you guys know that it's spring migration right now. Most of our birds left within the last month, and we knew as soon as we had a strong south breeze that they were going to be heading out. So this is a really fun animation showing exactly what that migration looks like. These are all juveniles. So they most likely don't have a pair or are not paired or don't have a mate yet. So we say that they're in Texas from scary to scary, so Halloween to tax day. But they start to leave us around this time of year, March and April. And on average, it takes them about 29 days to make it to Canada. And if they are paired, they'll begin nesting on arrival. Those that have been paired for a while kind of know the drill, so they'll begin nesting immediately. But those that are just learning, it takes them a little bit longer to figure it out. But these are juveniles, so they're doing some funky stuff like stopping in Saskatchewan for the whole summer. And D24 ends up super far west. We don't know what he was doing, but he spends the entirety of his summer in Western Canada. But in the fall, around September and October, they'll start heading back down. They'll stop in that Saskatchewan staging area for about 2 to 4 weeks. For that kind of really that longer rest and refueling stage. So it takes a little bit longer, about 45 days for them to make it down for the winter. But after they leave Saskatchewan, they make a pretty straight shot back down to the coast. So I'll talk a little bit about what they do when they're in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada. So they become sexually mature at 3 years old, but they typically don't lay their first egg till they're about 5. They do mate for life. They are monogamous, and they'll strengthen this pair bond with unison calling and dancing. So this picture on your upper left is what a unison call will look like. They're also famously known for their dancing. So as a form of flirting, they'll throw sticks and twigs, and they'll do a lot of head bobbing and wing flapping as a way to really strengthen their pair bond. We think this is tied to agility. If they are paired and they start nest building, their nests are about 2 to 5 feet wide. You can see one on your upper right, and these are made typically of bulrush. So this is a bulrush cross section. You can see it's kind of spongy and has these air pockets, so it can float on top of the water. A lot of times they'll actually stamp their vegetation all the way down to the bottom of the water body that they're on, because they don't nest in super deep water, just enough where they can hear predators coming. But they'll stamp it all the way down, kind of like a column. They normally lay about 2 eggs. It's what's known as the insurance hypothesis. Essentially, if the first one doesn't survive, they have a spare. And just to recap, around March and April, they'll arrive at wood buffalo. And April and May, they'll begin nest building and egg laying. And about 29 to 31 days later, the eggs will hatch. And I have a video, I hope this plays, for exactly what that dancing behavior looks like. This is from our co-founder, George Archibald, on the Platte River when it was frozen. So this is what that behavior looks like.
This meeting is being recorded.
So you see those showing of the crown and the head bobbing. And you'll see there, one of them starts to almost reach for sticks and twigs on the ice before realizing he or she is on ice, to do that kind of flipping moment of that flirting behavior with its mate. And they are sexually monomorphic, so using the naked eye, unless you're taking a blood sample, you can't tell male or female apart, but you can tell through their unison call. It's not a perfect system, but within their unison call, typically the male will call first, and he has a deeper call, and the female will call second, and she has more of this trumpety kind of trilling call. And I'll normally play it, but my sound has not been working. So once 30 days are up and they have chicks on the ground, they'll show what's called asynchronous hatching. So one chick will hatch about a day or two before little brother or sister. They are precocial and show rapid growth. My favorite whooping crane fact is they grow about 1 inch per day for the first 3 months of life. So they're 5 feet tall at 3 months. And this is coincidentally when they fledge, so they develop their flight feathers and are able to fly. While they're up there in Canada, they show a preference for diatom ponds that are clear and shallow. These are these ponds you see on your right. And they have a preference for dragonfly and damselfly nymphs, especially for the young, because their beaks are really small, so they're not able to, of course, eat the same food items as the adults. They'll also prey on frogs, rodents, small birds, specifically fish like brook stickleback and minnows, along with berries. They are opportunistic omnivores, so we say if they can fit it in their beak, they're going to eat it, which is very true. So once they head back to Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, down where we are, sometimes we get this really cool occurrence when they arrive back and we get whooping crane twins. So this is when both chicks survive to fledge and make it down to the coast. And in 2022, we had 11 sets of twins, which meant it was a really good resource year because both chicks were able to survive not only hatching and fledging, but also migration, which was super, super cool. So it's always great to see 2 little cinnamon colts, we call them colts, chasing after mom and dad. And while they're down here, they'll go through a juvenile color change. So when they arrive, they're this beautiful cinnamon brown color, and they haven't developed their forehead or their face mask yet. And about the time that they leave, they've lost a lot of that cinnamon color. It's really concentrated around just their face, and they've started to develop their black face mask. It takes about 18 months for them to go to full adult snowy white plumage, and once they return the following winter, we aren't able to tell juvenile from adults anymore. And in the fall and winter, their diet changes, of course, because their geography has changed. They're famously known down here for eating blue crabs and clams. We can say they eat about $80, we call them dollar crabs a day, so the smaller ones. They'll also eat harvest grains, acorns, and the Carolina wolfberry, which is this red berry in the center. They'll also eat snakes. They will basically slurp snakes like spaghetti. It's very interesting. And on to some of the research that we've been working on in Texas, which is some really fun things. We are all smiling in this picture, but it was actually the freeze that we had this year. So all of us with our thin Texas blood, we're definitely not ready for it to be super cold, but we had a ton of fun. We're focusing on 4 projects at the moment. The first being inland wintering of our population, their use of freshwater wetlands. We also have done some contaminant sampling in areas of high use, and we're looking into oversummering of our population. So here's another fun animation put together by our biologist. In 2011, coincidentally the same year that Louisiana birds were reintroduced, and also when a big portion of eastern migratory birds started short stopping, our birds started using these inland agricultural sites. So it was brought to our attention. And of course, like good scientists, we wanted to do some research to figure out why. So they started using areas northwest of Houston called Granger Lake, as well as just west of Houston, this area in Colorado and Wharton County. And so these little dots along the coast are where we would think you would typically find a whooping crane spending their winter along the salt marsh. But then we have these birds, for whatever reason, using these inland sites. And you can see that they're actually making these shorter migrations back down to the coast, but they're also hanging out for a big portion of their winter in that same area. So what we found from this study was that not only were these birds moving more in the inland sites, they were just moving more in general. So one of our hypotheses for why this is happening is this was during a major drought in Texas. And of course, our birds, we believe, remember their stopover points from migration. So we think they kind of just backtracked. Maybe there wasn't enough water or enough resources, so they just backtracked to their last stopover point and spent their winter because there were resources in those areas. But they've since been doing it to this day. We had 18 birds found in inland sites this last winter. So we started a study looking at their behavior. So this picture on your left is showing the salt marsh we would normally find them in, and the picture on your right is the inland sites, mostly rice, that we've been finding them in. So we started doing what's called scan sampling. So every minute on the minute for 40 minutes, we log their behavior. And we've collected 940 minutes in salt marsh and bays and 618 minutes in inland ag sites. We're looking at behaviors such as foraging, walking and flying, being in a restful state. We also call this loafing, any alertness, preening. There's actually a behavior that is aggressive preening. So they'll preen aggressively as a way to deter maybe another whooping crane in their territory or another animal. So this is also a social interaction. So it's very interesting to look at the behavioral differences between inland and salt marsh birds. Our birds that are using inland sites are much more skittish. So the birds in the salt marsh are very used to boat traffic and not necessarily being around humans, but they're used to more disturbance. But our birds using inland sites are very easy for humans to flush and just a lot more skittish overall. So why is this research important? If you look to the figure on your right, this is our habitat suitability map of what we know to be really good whooping crane habitat. So areas in red are known good whooping crane habitat. So when we think about the population expanding, we think they're going to expand into those areas and maybe even meet up with their Louisiana population somewhere in the middle because we're meeting in really good habitat. But instead, those birds are using those areas up near Houston where all those blue dots are. So most of what we know from their life history and from research comes from their core wintering range. So as we study these birds that are using inland sites, we'll just know more about the species as a whole. And then continued use of these inland areas has implications for how we plan for the population. So when it comes to making sure they have enough resources and water, along with being protected, we need to know where they are. Another important part is Texas produces about 225,000 acres of rice annually. So similar to how Louisiana birds have a symbiotic relationship with farmers in Louisiana, we would want a similar relationship for our Texas birds, and to make sure if they're using rice fields, we know. And also just understanding the habitat of these birds can help us inform management of what they're doing. Our next study was their use of freshwater wetlands. So while they are predominantly a wetland salt marsh species, they can not only tolerate salinity to a certain level, they don't have a salt exclusion gland. So they do need dietary fresh water. So this is what I call the beating heart map. So this shows river flow into our hydrologic region. And it's just a really good way to visualize river flow and freshwater availability. This was from 2004, and it just shows really low periods of freshwater input and some higher times of freshwater input. And for our birds, there is this relationship between drought, salinity, and diet. So when we have periods of drought, which of course increase salinity, this has impacts on some of their primary diet items down here on the coast, including blue crabs and the Carolina wolfberry. So to get a little bit more specific, it's generally thought that once base salinities reach about 15 to 23 parts per thousand, they'll need dietary freshwater elsewhere. This is an example using the Carolina wolfberry. The top photo is during a wet year, and you can see there's quite a bit of fruit production on this wolfberry plant. And the bottom picture is of a drought year. You can see we have exactly one fruit produced on this plant. So of course, this has a relationship with our birds, and our salt marshes can suffer under these salty conditions. From a previous study, it was found that whooping cranes spend more time in the prairie and inland wetlands during drought years, and this could be because they're looking for resources and, of course, that dietary fresh water. So we wanted to look at what wetlands cranes were using and what characteristics they had, so we could just better understand essentially what wetlands they liked. So we went out and we took water quality measurements like salinity, pH, and dissolved oxygen, and we also looked at soil properties. And then we also looked for the presence of dragon and damselfly larvae, because we know this is another food item that they are eating while they're down here. And then we ran some vegetation transects to see what the predominant vegetation was at these wetlands. And the way we chose the wetlands that we went to, some of our birds have transmitters. So we're able to look at that transmitter data to see what wetlands they're using. And to confirm this and make sure that cranes were actually using the wetlands we thought that they were, we did some game camera trapping to validate that data from transmitter birds. So these are some of our game camera highlights. Last year, we deployed cameras at 11 wetlands and collected about 76,000 game camera photos. So an amazing group of community scientists helped us to process those photos and confirm use by whooping cranes and other species. Because we think of whooping cranes as an umbrella species or as an ambassador, because they are federally protected and some species are not. The management practices we put in place and the protections we put in place for whooping cranes can have an effect, a positive effect on other species using similar habitat. So why was this research project important? This has implications for management of federal and state lands for cranes, as well as private lands as well. Much of Texas is privately owned, and cranes, of course, do not understand fence lines and what private land means, so they are still using private lands as well. It also highlights which wetlands are important and why. So we're able to go in and look at those characteristics of what makes a good crane wetland, and be able to inform land managers so we can really focus in our wetland restoration efforts for crane-friendly wetlands. Our third project was contaminant sampling. This was a new project this last winter in partnership with the Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service. What we looked at was heavy metals in AIV, so avian influenza. And we also did some sediment samples to look for neonics. and any other either wastewater runoff or ag runoff. So we deployed these loggers, this one you see floating on your right. And this looks like a very beautiful, serene landscape. And it was really, really fun. But this was, of course, we don't typically submerge ourselves in water for our research, but this was during the one freeze Texas got this winter, where we got to go out into the bays when the water temperature was in the teens. So we had so much fun, but it was definitely a bonding moment for all of us deploying these loggers to look for any contaminants in areas that whooping cranes are using. So these have since been sent back to Canada and they are processing them. They're going to come back hopefully next year so we can take some more samples and look at any contaminants in high use crane areas. One really interesting part of last summer, and will be perhaps a very interesting part of this approaching summer, I started in this position about a year ago. I'd never seen a whooping crane before. I came from the turtle world, so I was just really getting into birding. And I was told that I would not be able to see my first whooping crane, most likely wild whooping crane, until about Halloween. But then in April and May, the presence of 3 cranes were brought to our attention. And we actually were able to track them all summer because they oversummered on the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. So it would go out 1 to 2 times per week and go and pretty much just confirm that they were there. And those scan samples that we used in our behavior study, we were able to do a few of those on the 3 cranes that stayed. And as a result of seeing them for so many months, we were able to place 2 game cameras at a freshwater wetland we knew that they were using, and we were able to get these photos. So the one on your left, it really just gave us a good idea of body condition. They're a little bit skinny, they're a little bit kind of raggedy, which means they most likely haven't gone through a full body molt, which isn't completely uncommon. They just might not have gone through it yet, but it brought to our attention this specifically, because we didn't know why they stayed. They didn't have bands or transmitters, so we didn't have a frame of reference for how old they were or their sex. But this one photo changed a little bit because you see these bright feathers compared to their dingy, the body feathers. And this points that they went through a flight feather molt, that at least 2 of them had gone through a flight feather molt while they were on the Texas coast. And it might not have been the reason that they stayed, because it takes about 6 weeks for them to molt and regrow their flight feathers. But it does bring up a really interesting fact that they did, in fact, still go through a flightless molt while they were on the Texas coast. So we are in the midst of writing a paper on oversummering in our population and also the eastern migratory population, and really just digging into why is this occurring, what are the possible reasons, and what are the outcomes from the cranes staying. The second part of what we do here in Texas is outreach and education, and we do this to increase awareness, empathy, and appreciation for whooping cranes. This started as really a way to reduce number of shootings. So a big part of what we do is hunter education. Each year we hand out packets and brochures and info and any information on proper IDing of waterfowl, and of course how to properly ID a whooping crane. And then we participate in courtroom advocacy and make sure that judges know the value of a whooping crane. This has really started to tie into a new facet of my job, is informing renewable energy development. I talked a little bit earlier about how power line collisions are a leading cause of mortality today. So renewable energy is very fast growing, and we are, of course, very grateful that it is becoming more of an option. Texas is one of the leaders in renewables, but we want to make sure that they are mitigating for our highly endangered bird species. So part of what I do is I go in and I make sure that they have scientific research about power lines and whooping cranes. We also work with community scientists on whooping crane research. So this is Barb on the lower photo. She is one of my interns, and we could not do much of our research without our community scientists. We have an office of 4 people and we currently have 6 research projects ongoing. So my favorite saying is science doesn't happen alone, and we definitely rely on our community scientists. So this year, since I started last April, we developed a new program called Whooper Walk. So if you guys are ever in Texas, between Scary and Scary, while the cranes are here, I will be doing this again this year. It is a weekly guided walk in collaboration with one of our state parks. So this year we had 80 attendees at 10 walks from 10 states, 39 cities, and 1 additional country, which was Canada. We mostly had the general community, birders and naturalists, and K through 12 students attend, but we were able to have 2 filming days. So we had 2 documentaries being filmed during Whooper Walk to help us get the message of the whooping cranes story out to a larger audience, which was amazing. But we hope to grow this next year and make it more accessible to more people. So please, if you're ever in Texas, come hang out with us at Whooper Walk. And for our future outreach and education, we really want to hone in on our K through 12 whooping crane curriculum and make sure that this is not only being taught in our community, but also in schools. So we're working with a local high school to build in some whooping crane curriculum into their science already built curriculum. We also want to expand our hunter outreach. We did have a poaching incident in 2021 in Oklahoma. So we're expanding our hunter education into Oklahoma this year and not just the state of Texas. And we're hoping to one day be completely in the Central Flyway. We also now engage in energy siting and power line issues. And the last facet of what we do is landowner and partner engagement. So again, reiterating how important freshwater and habitat is for our growing population. It is so great that they are growing each year, but they need habitat to be able to sustain that population. So we want to promote land protection and sound habitat management, which is part of why we did the wetland study, so we can better inform land managers for how to manage for a growing whooping crane population. So we actually started our own cost share program this year called Wells and Water for Whoopers. So we will either do a portion of the dirt work or build a new solar well in areas of high crane use to make sure that that water is not only available for whooping cranes, but other species that are reliant on fresh water while they're down here on the coast. And so far, it's been pretty successful. Last part about what I will talk about is if you guys ever see a banded bird in the wild, of course, I'm sure you know this, but it's really important for our whooping crane population if you see them in the Central Flyway or in Texas, because this is how we do a lot of our research. Some of our birds have transmitters and bands, some of them just have bands, but a lot of those transmitters die after about 4 years. So we use eBird and iNat a lot to pull from data. So we really rely on those eBird reports to be able to know where some of our cranes are. So if you ever see a banded crane out in the wild from any of our populations, please take a photo if you can. Sometimes we cannot accept the eBird report without a photo. And you can either report those to eBird, iNat. We have a portal on Saving Cranes, which is our website, as well as Texas Whooper Watch also has a portal where you can report those. And I will finish with one of my favorite quotes by Robert Porter Allen, who wrote The Whooping Crane. When you sit crouched in a blind and watch an adult whooper stride close by you, his head high and proud, his bearing arrogant and imposing, you feel the presence of a strength and of a stubborn will to survive that is one of the vital intangibles of this entire situation. Certainly it cannot be overlooked. We have a strong conviction that the whooping crane will keep his part of the bargain and will fight for survival every inch of the way. What are we going to do to help? And there are ways that you can help us out as an organization. You can join our flock and become a member, or also I'm always looking for volunteers, like those 76,000 game camera photos. If you are like to do that type of community science work, I'm always looking for more people to help us process. We're going to have even more photos this year. Please tell your friends and family about whooping cranes. They're such a majestic, amazing species, very easy to talk about. It's why I love my job so much. So please just talk about the cranes. You can also like us on social media. We have both an Instagram and a Facebook that not only gives updates about whooping cranes, but all 15 species. We do a monthly From the Field webinar series as an organization. So it talks about our work in all of the countries that we work in. It's very interesting if you ever feel like logging on. We have some backlogged ones as well that are very interesting. And thank you guys so much for your time. And I can take any questions.
I guess I'll start. I think a lot of us are going to have the same question. Where in New Jersey did these birds once live? Do you have any idea?
I looked it up my first week on the job. I actually looked that up because my roommate was from Jersey, and it predates pretty much literature. I think maybe Robert Ford Allen talked about it once in his book, but it just vaguely mentions it.
So we have no idea.
We have no idea. We just know that they had been spotted. There had been written accounts of whooping cranes in New Jersey. So someone wrote it in a letter or a journal, and which is really cool.
And we're in Florida.
In Florida, they were, I'm not sure exactly the refuge. They've kind of dispersed since. I know it's South Florida, I believe, probably north of Miami.
Peyton, if you stop sharing, Evan will be able to see who's got questions.
There we go.
Yeah, anybody want to just pop in with a question?
Gary, did you have your hand up?
No, I didn't.
Who is sleeping?
I-
I have a question.
Absolutely.
So you talked about community education and engagement. Do you ever experience resistance when you're out educating about the cranes and trying to obviously get hunters to not shoot them, etc.?
We are very lucky where I'm at because economically, a lot of people do really well in this area because of the whooping cranes. So I think they know how important they are for the local economy. But they're just kind of revered here. Sometimes people love them a little too much. So it's more of an issue of overstepping than it is of meeting any resistance. I think that could possibly be an issue we would face moving up the Central Flyway. It's something they face more in Louisiana because the birds were gone for 60 plus years, that people don't know that they have whooping cranes in Louisiana. So that's why we really focus our outreach and education in those areas. We're not doing research as an organization there. We're just doing outreach and education to make sure people know that they have Louisiana whooping cranes.
So what happens when they breed with the sandhill cranes? You had mentioned that they're called whoopsies.
Yes.
So does that mean they're sterile if they breed with I mean, what's the downside?
They're sterile, and there's, I believe, two other species of crane that actually create a fertile hybrid. And I think people are just worried about what that would mean. But the whoopsies are infertile, so it takes away from our breeding population if they're paired with a sandhill, because they're so case selected that each individual is so important. So that's one of our problems with, if they're over summering and they're of breeding age, it takes them out of our breeding population, so that missing a breeding season has such high implications for such a small population, especially for genetic diversity.
All right, and I have one last question. I've never seen the movie Fly Away Home. Is this one of these films that is like completely Disney-fied the whole whooping crane story, or is it like something that you would recommend?
I think it was for ducks. So it definitely was.
Oh, it's not even whooping cranes?
It's not.
Like,
It's.
oh, I just assumed it was whooping cranes. Oh, it's like they're teaching a duck how to fly?
Is either ducks or geese. I think it was geese. They were teaching them how to migrate using a small aircraft. But it was a very similar situation to. It's more of a kids movie. It's really fun. Definitely have to watch it once. But they actually, for that, it's called Operation Migration, and for that, they practice with sandhill cranes first because they're the more abundant species, so that they could get it right before they started Operation Migration for whooping cranes.
Are the behaviors you see with them the same as with the sandhill cranes, with the jumping and dancing? Or is it a different mating procedure?
It's pretty similar. Sandhill cranes will do a little bit of a different behavior with showing their crown. You'll see more of the crown showing with sandhill cranes, I believe.
Is it the same kind of crown, not feathers?
It's the blood. But they can really inflate it, and it'll get very red, and you can really see the difference. And they can also, our past director would always call it like sucking it down, and they'll just right over their scalp, and it's kind of eerie, but it's also really cool.
Can I have a fast question. The 3 birds that you showed a little bit earlier in your program that over summered, I guess,
Yes.
were they immature birds?
We don't know their ages, unfortunately. Only about 10% of our population has bands, and less than that have transmitters. So we will hopefully have that paper out soon. We had a bird in the past that they called the lobstick prince. He oversummered because he was bit in the neck, we assume, by a snake, and ended up with a scar. So he's one of the only cranes that we know of that has an identifier outside of a band or transmitter. But we just can't tell them apart without those identifiers.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, I guess any more questions, or that does it for tonight?
I have one last question. Are they smarter than the sandhill cranes? Do you find them walking around on the streets?
As in, who would win in a fight, or?
No. In Florida, you go down the highway and you have to stop because the sandhill cranes are sort of walking around on the highway.
They are pretty desensitized there. The only interaction I've really seen, we have the place where I do Whipper Walk is in Lamar at Big Tree, and it's kind of this interesting area because it's basically someone's front yard, and a bunch of these cranes hang out there, and it's pretty famous. But it's one place that you can see sandhill cranes and whooping cranes standing right next to each other. And whooping cranes are pretty territorial, so you're like, what? But when sandhill cranes have a juvenile with them, they will chase the whooping cranes off. So they're not scared to communicate with them. But I wouldn't know intellectually. Sandhill cranes do paint their feathers with mud, which I think is really cool, as we assume a form of camouflage.
Is there a simple answer to why the sandhill cranes have succeeded so well and whooping cranes have been so, threatened?
Most likely because they started with more, they didn't drop as low. And there have been cases of divorce essentially in sandhill cranes. We assume we have cases of divorce and swapping mates in whooping cranes as well. So their genetic diversity could be higher. Because we hit that such a bottleneck and lost so much genetic diversity. So there's always that.
Wait, which species does the wife swapping?
Sandhill cranes will occasionally call it getting divorced.
Like a key party, that kind of thing?
We don't really know.
Well, that's one fascinating thing that we learned tonight.
Sandhill cranes get divorced sometimes. So do
Yeah.
whooping cranes.
All right, well, Paityn, that was terrific. That was really absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having
really,
me.
really appreciate you coming tonight.
Yeah, that was very informative, and it was a lot of fun to watch, and it was very well prepared and presented.
Thank you.
So I know that Corpus Christi area and it's a nice area.
Well, if you guys are ever, please let me know if you guys are ever down in this area, and I would be happy to show you cranes or other birds. We have a lot of other really fantastic birds.
Thanks. Where in Oklahoma are you from?
I'm from Duncan, Oklahoma. Most of my family's from the Panhandle.
Oh, okay.
Pretty small towns.
Yeah. I work with someone from Tulsa,
Okay.
and he owns they own Quick Trip now. He
Oh, that's
married
cool.
well. He married well.
I would say so.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of them out there, huh?
Oh yeah, there's a ton.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Sandy,
you
is
very
there
much.
anything I need to do? Thank you, Paityn. Is there anything I need to do? Everyone is leaving. I'm gonna hit leave.
You can stop recording.
Okay. I'm gonna stop recording. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next.
Okay.
Oh, Sandy, what do we have next? Don't we have
One last announcement, the virtual bird walk for April is not happening. We are not going to do it because nobody's going to be around.